So we've been discussing the Jews of Christian Spain, like we talked about last week, the disputation between the Ramban and Pablo Cristiani. So we've been talking about the life of Jews living in Spain under Christian rule, and we kind of compared that to the life of Jews living in Spain under Muslim rule. We also spoke about last week how that comparison is not always so clear, that life under the Muslim rule wasn't always so great, even though generally it was, and life under Christian rule wasn't always so terrible, even though generally it kind of was. We're going to speak later on in the week about the devastating and tragic end of the Jewish life in Spain. But before that, we're going to talk about an interesting episode in Jewish history that had a lot to do with the Jews of Spain and more so the Jews of France and Germany, the Jews of Ashkenaz, called the Maimonidean controversy. And as you might have guessed, the Maimonidean controversy had to do with a person named Maimonides. Maimonides, also probably more famously, at least in our circles, known as the Rambam, Rav Moshe ben Maimon. So there was a controversy surrounding the Rambam, some of his teachings and some of his beliefs. So we're going to get to that, and it's very exciting, it's very interesting, so I hope you're excited for it. But before we talk about the Maimonidean controversy, we're going to need to go back and talk about Maimonides himself. We're going to need to talk about the Rambam, because if we're going to understand the controversy surrounding the Rambam, we're going to have to understand the Rambam himself. So we're going to go back to a time earlier in the year when we talked about the Jewish Golden Age of Spain. So we talked about Jews living under Muslim rule in Spain, who it was a golden age, as you remember, because the Jews living there were contributing and benefiting from that society in all kinds of different ways, in science and medicine and mathematics and art, in literature and poetry, in astronomy, all kinds of things. The Jewish people were involved, and the Rambam was one of those kinds of people. The Rambam was this exceptional person. He was a Renaissance man. The Rambam, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, the Rambam was involved in all kinds of different things. He was a scholar of basically every kind that he could possibly be. So the Rambam was born in Cordoba, Spain, which was one of those great cities in Spain where all kinds of learning was going on, in the early part of the 12th century, the 1100s, around 1135, and he died in 1204. So we talked last week about the Almohads, the radical Muslim sect that came up from North Africa and then moved up into the Iberian Peninsula, which is the country of Spain, or which is the country of Spain. So the Almohads come in, and they're trying to force people to convert or die. They're violent, and they're radical. They're not friendly to Jews or Christians or pagans. Certainly, they're not friendly to any non-Muslims, and even to certain Muslims, they're not friendly to. As we know today, like you have wars going on between Shiites and Sunnis, so the Almohads were also not friendly to all kinds of Muslims either. They were very particular. So the Rambam ends up having to leave Spain in order to escape the Almohads. He goes to North Africa, Morocco, and that doesn't work out. So he tries to live in Eretz Yisrael, which, if you read some of the Rambam's writings, he was certainly passionate about Eretz Yisrael and believed that really Jews should live in Eretz Yisrael. And he tried that himself, but also it didn't really work out, mainly, I believe, because of persecution. So he ends up leaving Eretz Yisrael and going to Egypt, and he lives for the rest of his life in Egypt. Which is kind of ironic, because the Torah tells us that after the Jewish people, after Bnei Israel leaves Egypt, we're not supposed to return to Egypt. But what are you going to do when the Jews are kicked around and persecuted in country after country after country? You got to go where you're able to live. And so the Rambam lives out the rest of his life in Egypt, which is where he writes many of his very, very important works, as we're about to see. What's interesting about the Rambam is if you see that he lives in southern or middle of Spain, which is under Muslim control at the time, and then he goes to Morocco under Muslim control, and spends some time in Eretz Yisrael, very little, and then in Egypt. So he basically lives his entire life under Muslim control. So at the time, and in the world at the time, especially in that part of the world, in Spain and in Europe, really in Spain and in France and Germany, there were basically two powers or two main powers. There's the Muslims and there's the Muslims and there were the Christians. Obviously, if you go much farther east, so there are other powers like the Mongols and other dynasties over there. And if you go really far west in the New World, like the Native Americans, but we don't even know about them yet. So that this time in the world there's the Christians and the Muslims, and the Rambam really doesn't spend any of his life under Christian rule. He lives his entire life under Muslim rule, which is interesting. So the Rambam has this deal worked out with his brother. So the Rambam is recognized as this brilliant mind, a great writer, a great teacher, a great thinker, just a super genius, can absorb information and can sit with what we call hasmada or hasmada or hatmada, where he can sit and he can learn all day long, and just soak up all this knowledge and then be an excellent teacher. So he works out this deal with his brother that his brother is going to support the family. His brother is going to sell precious stones and make enough money to support himself and his brother Moshe, the Rambam, and the Rambam will just learn. He'll just learn and he'll teach and he'll become this great Torah scholar, and his brother will support the family. So unfortunately, tragedy strikes. The ship that his brother is traveling on at one point gets capsizes at sea, and the brother passes away. The brother dies, the fortune is lost, and the Rambam, aside from obviously the terrible tragedy of losing a brother, so he now doesn't have anyone who's supporting him, so he has to go and get a job now. So he becomes a doctor. Probably it wasn't like 4 years of medical school and then like a bunch of years of residency and things like that. It probably didn't work like that. I'm not sure exactly what the process of becoming a doctor was. Someone just wakes up one day and says, hey, I need a job. I guess I'll be a doctor. So, kind of different. And here, this guy is probably what the Rambam looked like, kind of Middle Eastern looking. And he has a stethoscope. So that's probably what the Rambam did. Eventually, the Rambam becomes the doctor for very high-ranking Muslim officials, either the Sultan or a close advisor of the Sultan. So that's kind of a big deal. And so that's one of the things that the Rambam is famous for, is being a doctor, not just being a Torah scholar, but also being a doctor, and a successful one at that. Another thing that the Rambam was known for and was very important is that he was a communal leader. So in addition to being a teacher of Torah, a doctor, so he's this busy doctor who serves the community. He writes a letter one time about how he serves, he goes and he works for the Sultan, and then he comes home and he works, and he has a line going out the door of all these people that he's treating, and he teaches Torah also. So he's a very, very busy man. So in addition to his work as a doctor and his work as a Torah scholar, he serves as the leader of the Jewish community. So we talked about, if you remember way back when, we talked about the Jews in Bavel who the Reish Galuta, right? They had leaders in that community. The Reish Galuta would answer, and the Gaonim, right? They would kind of answer to the non-Jewish leadership at the time, whether it was the Persians or the Muslims. So the Rambam became the Nagid, which is the word that was used for these appointed leaders of the Jewish community. So he serves as a judge. So whenever there's a dispute between Jews about whether, some kind of monetary case or anything like that, so the Nagid serves as a judge, and he also is he's the posek, he's the gadol. He's the one who's answering all kinds of, halachic questions. So if someone goes to a rabbi and the rabbi doesn't know the answer, so they'll go to the Rambam and they'll ask him, these big, huge questions. So he has a series of Sheilotu Tshuvot, like we have here, Tshuvot v'Sheilot, answers and questions, kind of the way opposite than we usually say it. But anyway, so the Rambam has a series of Sheilotu Tshuvot, answers to questions, usually halachic, but some also more other than, different than halachic, some like philosophical type questions as well. The Rambam writes some extremely, extremely important work. So we're just going to talk about some of the highlights, although we're not going to cover everything that he writes. But it's really important, if we're going to understand the Rambam, we're going to understand his contributions to Torah and to Judaism, we have to understand some of these really, really important works. A lot of the works that he wrote were not actually written in Hebrew. A lot of them were written actually in Arabic or in kind of an interesting form of Arabic. It was like Arabic letters. It was like what some people call Judeo-Arabic. So it was like Arabic letters in Hebrew words. I don't know how to read that, so I can't really tell you much more about it. But it's really just interesting to note like that people were learning Torah in the Arabic alphabet because they wanted to learn Torah, but a lot of them maybe weren't able to actually read Hebrew. So it's kind of like, if you can imagine someone who wanted to learn Torah and couldn't actually speak Hebrew, like, you know, there would be books that would be written in another language other than Hebrew, like Art Scroll, for example. So things like that. So that's kind of interesting. So anyway, so here are some of the really important works of the Rambam. One of the first thing that comes to mind for many people, especially halachic Jews, is the Mishnah Torah. So the Mishnah Torah is a huge, huge work that it covers every single area of halacha, and including the areas of halacha that are not applicable in this time, even in the Rambam's time. Meaning, he talks about the laws pertaining to the Beit HaMikdash and korbanot. So even though those are not applicable because we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, the Rambam still wrote about them in great detail and describes exactly what a Jew has to do. So the goal of the Mishnah Torah is to describe in every situation, whether it's on Shabbos, on Purim, on when you wake up in the morning, when you go to sleep at night, whether it's in the Beit HaMikdash, wherever it is, the goal of the Mishnah Torah is to teach a Jew what he is supposed to do in every single situation, what the halacha says, and it's of course based on the Gemara. So the Rambam cuts out all the discussions of the Gemara, all the background, the arguments, and Agadah, all that stuff. The Rambam basically cuts it all out and says, bottom line, here's the halacha. So that's the Mishnah Torah, and that was one of the only things he actually wrote completely in Hebrew. Then there's the Sefer HaMitzvot, which is much shorter than the Mishnah Torah, and it's just a list, basically. These are the 613 mitzvot that appear in the Torah. So it's you might think that like that's silly, there's no reason for a book for that, but actually there is a machloket among different Rishonim, the Rambam of course being a Rishon. What are the 613 mitzvot? Everyone agrees because the Gemara says there are 613 mitzvot, but what are those 613? Does tefillin count as 2 mitzvot, or does it only count as 1? Well, if you count it as 2, so then you might have to knock out another mitzvah and say that that doesn't really count. If you count it as 1, so then maybe you have room for another mitzvah that you'll have to add. So that was Sefer HaMitzvot. In the Moreh Nevuchim, he writes, this is a copy of the Moreh Nevuchim, which is also written in Arabic. That is a book of philosophy, basically a book of dealing with some of the most important issues of Jewish thought. And a lot of it is comments on psukim in the Torah and elsewhere in Tanakh. He writes a Perush HaMishnayot, an explanation of the Mishnah, also in Arabic, which if you read the Mishnah without a Perush, sometimes it can be very, very difficult. So he's kind of like what Rashi does in the Gemara, the Rambam does in the Mishnah. And in the Perush HaMishnah, the Rambam does, within that, he kind of works his way into a lot of like philosophical discussions about, belief and the Ani Mamins, the song Ani Mamin, the 13 principles of faith, that comes from the Rambam's explanation of one of the Mishnayot in Masechet Sanhedrin. So he works into the Perush HaMishnah a lot of really important philosophical thought. And then finally, of course, like we mentioned before, he had Teshuvot as well. So he had answers to questions, halachic and also philosophical questions that people asked. So these are just some of the most important things that the Rambam wrote. But like I said, there are other things that he wrote as well. So just to recap, before we get into the Maimonidean controversy, the controversy about the Rambam, it's really important to understand who the Rambam was, why he's such an important figure, and just to realize, just to take a second to try to think about the fact that he was a person, he didn't live that long, and yet he accomplished so very much. He was able to write and teach and work and make contributions to philosophy and to Torah and to it's really unbelievable to think that one person would have done all this. Someone once wrote that if you didn't know any better, you would think that the Rambam wasn't a person, but he was a university, and all the things were an academy, and all the things that were produced by the Rambam were produced by a school full of people, not just by one person. So now we'll talk about the controversy surrounding the Rambam's life.